Welcome back to the GMP and Quality Fundamentals series, and this is Lecture 19. In Lecture 18, we talked about regulatory inspections and how to prepare for them. One of the areas inspectors always check is your supplier management program. And at the heart of that program is the topic of today's lecture: technical agreements with suppliers. You cannot control what you do not define. When another organization is performing activities that affect your product quality, you need a written agreement that defines exactly who is responsible for what. That document is the technical agreement. Let us get into it. Here is what we will cover today. Number 1, you will understand what a technical agreement is and why it is specifically required under GMP regulations. Number 2, you will learn the difference between a technical agreement, a quality agreement, and a commercial supply contract. These are 3 different documents that serve 3 different purposes. Number 3, you will learn the mandatory content of a technical agreement under EU GMP and FDA requirements. Number 4, you will understand how to manage technical agreements actively throughout the entire supplier relationship, not just at the moment of signing. And number 5, you will know exactly what inspectors look for when they review your technical agreement files, so you can be ready. Let me start with the definition and the regulatory basis. A technical agreement is a written contract between a GMP organization and a supplier, contractor, or service provider that clearly defines which GMP responsibilities belong to which party. Its purpose is to ensure that quality standards are maintained across every step of the supply chain, not just inside your own 4 walls. This is not optional. Multiple major regulatory frameworks require it. EU GMP Part 1, Chapter 7 on outsourced activities requires written contracts that clearly define the quality responsibilities of the contract giver and the contract acceptor for every outsourced GMP activity. EU GMP Annex 16 specifically addresses quality agreements for batch release and defines what the qualified person must verify from contract manufacturers and testing laboratories. FDA 21 CFR Part 211 requires that contract manufacturers and testing laboratories operate under agreements that ensure GMP compliance. And ICH Q10, the International Pharmaceutical Quality System Standard, requires that all outsourced activities are managed under written agreements that define quality responsibilities. The regulatory message is completely consistent across all major authorities. If you outsource a GMP activity, you must govern that relationship with a written agreement. Before we go further, I want to clarify something that causes a lot of confusion in practice. There are 3 related documents that companies create when working with suppliers. They are not the same document, and they serve very different purposes. The first is the supply contract. This is a commercial and legal document. It covers purchase price and payment terms, delivery schedules and lead times, liability and indemnification, intellectual property and confidentiality, and termination conditions. It is managed by procurement and legal teams. It is not a GMP document, but it must be consistent with the technical agreement. The second is the technical agreement. This is a GMP document. It defines the quality responsibilities. Which party is responsible for each GMP activity? What the specifications are for materials and methods. How changes are notified and approved. How deviations and complaints are handled. And what audit rights the contract giver holds. This is what regulators check. It is owned by QA. The third is the quality agreement. This is a pharmaceutical-specific document that goes beyond the technical agreement in regulated pharmaceutical manufacturing. It covers batch release responsibilities and the obligations of the qualified person, regulatory submission requirements, pharmacovigilance and recall procedures, and GMP certificate management. It is required for pharmaceutical contract manufacturers and contract testing laboratories. In some organizations, the technical agreement and quality agreement are combined into a single document. In others, they are separate. What matters is that all the required content is covered and that QA owns and manages these documents. Now let us be specific about when a technical agreement is required. The principle is simple. Anytime a GMP-regulated activity is performed by an external party, that relationship must be governed by a written technical agreement. This includes contract manufacturers. Any third party manufacturing your product or a component of it needs a full technical agreement covering all relevant manufacturing steps and quality controls. Contract testing laboratories. Laboratories performing release testing, stability testing, method validation, or any GMP analytical work on your behalf. This is directly relevant for those of you working in food testing or pharmaceutical testing laboratories. If a food manufacturer sends samples to your lab for GMP-relevant testing, there should be a technical agreement in place. Packaging and labeling contractors. Third-party packers or labellers who handle your product in its finished or near-finished form. API and raw material suppliers. Suppliers of active pharmaceutical ingredients, excipients, or critical raw materials where the supplier performs GMP-controlled manufacturing steps themselves. Warehousing and distribution providers. Third-party logistics companies storing or distributing your product under temperature or humidity controls specified by GMP or product requirements. And IT and LIMS service providers. Companies providing validated computer systems used for GMP data management. If your LIMS is hosted by a third party, or if a software company validates your electronic batch record system, a technical agreement is required. Every technical agreement must contain 8 core sections. Let me walk you through each one. Section 1 is scope and purpose. This must be specific. Name the products, the activities, the testing methods, and the sites covered. A scope that says covers all activities performed by the supplier is not acceptable. Be precise. Section 2 is the responsibility matrix. This is the most critical section of the entire document. For every GMP activity covered by the agreement, define whether the contract giver or the contract acceptor is responsible. We will look at this in detail on the next slide. Section 3 covers specifications and methods. Reference all applicable specifications. Test methods and acceptance criteria by document number and version. State which party is responsible for maintaining and updating each one. Section 4 defines change control and notification requirements. What constitutes a change that requires notification? How much advance notice must the supplier provide? Which changes require the contract giver's approval before implementation? This section is one of the most commonly deficient areas in technical agreements. Section 5 covers deviation and complaint handling. If a deviation occurs at the supplier, who must be notified? Within what time frame? Who performs the investigation? Who approves the corrective action? Section 6 grants audit rights. The contract giver must have the documented right to audit the supplier. Define the frequency, the scope, and the notice period. This section is non-negotiable. Section 7 covers regulatory inspection support. The supplier must agree to notify the contract giver immediately if they receive a regulatory inspection that covers activities under this agreement. And Section 8 defines document retention and access rights. How long must records be kept? Who owns them? What access does the contract giver have to the supplier's GMP documentation? Let me spend more time on the responsibility matrix because it is where most technical agreements either succeed or fail. The responsibility matrix is a table where every row is a specific GMP activity, and the columns define whether the contract giver or the contract acceptor is responsible for that activity. The rule is simple: every critical activity must have exactly one responsible party. One tick in one column per row for every critical task. Looking at the example on this slide, batch manufacturing. The contract acceptor, the supplier, performs it. But the contract giver must approve the batch record before release. One party performs, the other approves. Raw material specifications. The contract giver owns these. The supplier must comply with them. The supplier does not define their own specifications for materials going into the contract giver's product. Release testing for finished goods. The contract giver performs or authorizes this. The supplier does not decide when a finished product is released. In-process testing during manufacturing. The supplier performs this per the contract giver's approved test methods. Deviation investigation. This is one of the few areas where both parties may be involved. But even here, the agreement must define the escalation triggers and who has the final authority. SOP maintenance for manufacturing procedures. The supplier owns and maintains these, but they must notify the contract giver if critical SOPs are revised. Equipment qualification. The supplier is responsible. The contract giver may have the right to review and approve the qualification documentation. Regulatory submission updates. The contract giver is always responsible for their own regulatory dossier and audit rights. The contract giver performs the audit. The supplier must support and facilitate it. The bottom of the slide shows the legend. Green ticks for responsible, dashes for not responsible, and white circles for shared activities that must be further defined in the notes column. Never leave a critical activity in the shared category without a clear escalation and decision path. One of the most common inspection findings related to supplier agreements is the discovery that a supplier made a significant change to their process, their facility, or their analytical method without notifying the contract giver. This happens more often than you would expect. A supplier replaces a critical piece of equipment. A supplier changes their synthesis route. A supplier switches to a different raw material grade. And none of this is communicated until an OS result or a product failure reveals the change months later. The technical agreement must define 3 categories of change, each with different notification requirements. Category 1: changes requiring pre-approval. These are the most significant changes. A change in manufacturing site. A change in API synthesis route. A change in analytical test method. A change in specification limits. A change in primary packaging material or supplier. For all of these, the supplier must notify the contract giver at minimum 3 months in advance, and the contract giver must formally approve before any implementation. Category 2: changes requiring notification only. These are moderate changes where the contract giver needs to be informed but does not need to pre-approve. Equipment replacement with an equivalent design. Minor SOP updates that do not affect critical parameters. A change in LIMS software version. A change in key personnel roles. The supplier notifies within 30 days and the contract giver reviews and may request an impact assessment. Category 3: changes that must be documented by the supplier. These are routine operational changes within validated parameters. Routine column or reagent lot changes. Analyst assignment changes for routine testing. Preventive maintenance activities. These are documented in the supplier's change log and are reviewed during audits. The exact categories and timelines in your agreement will depend on the nature of the relationship and the risk level of the activities. But every technical agreement must contain this structure. A signed technical agreement is not the end of your work. It is the beginning of an ongoing management responsibility. Inspectors can immediately recognize a technical agreement that was created, signed, and then filed away for years. It shows in the dates. It shows in the version history. And it shows in the fact that the content no longer reflects what the supplier is actually doing. There are 5 ongoing management activities that keep a technical agreement alive and inspection ready. Annual review. Review every technical agreement at minimum once a year. Is the scope still accurate? Have any responsibilities changed? Has the supplier made changes that affect the agreement content? Update the document and have it re-signed by both parties when changes are made. Supplier performance monitoring. Track your supplier KPIs. On-time delivery. OS rate from supplier testing. Deviation frequency. Response time to change notifications. Poor performance is a trigger for an unscheduled agreement review and potentially for requalification of the supplier. Audit program integration. Your annual supplier audit schedule should be directly aligned with your technical agreements. The audit verifies that the supplier is actually operating in accordance with what the agreement says. Any gap between the agreement and observed practice is a finding. Change tracking log. Maintain a formal log of all changes notified by the supplier under the technical agreement. Record the notification date, the contract giver's review decision, and the confirmed implementation date. This log is frequently requested by inspectors. Requalification triggers. Define in the agreement what events require the supplier to be requalified. A change to a new manufacturing site. A significant process change. A failed internal or external audit. Receipt of a regulatory warning letter. These triggers must be explicitly written into the agreement, so there is no ambiguity about when requalification is required. Let me tell you specifically what inspectors look for when they review your technical agreement files, because this prepares you to have those files inspection ready. The first question an inspector asks is simply, does one exist at all? For every outsourced GMP activity, there must be a written technical agreement. Inspectors will cross-reference your approved supplier list against your technical agreement register. If there is a supplier on your list without a corresponding agreement, that is an immediate finding. Second, is it current and signed? The agreement must be signed by authorized representatives of both parties. And it must have a defined review frequency with evidence that reviews have actually taken place. An agreement signed 5 years ago with no subsequent review is not inspection ready. Third, is the scope complete and specific? Inspectors read the scope section carefully. Vague descriptions like covers all quality-related activities are a finding. The scope must name the specific products, activities, test methods, and specifications covered by the agreement. Fourth, are responsibilities unambiguous? Inspectors look specifically for gaps and overlaps in the responsibility matrix. Any critical activity with no clearly assigned owner is an immediate observation. Fifth, does it cover change notification with specific requirements? Inspectors will ask you directly, how does this supplier notify you if they make a process change? If your answer involves anything informal, that is a finding. The technical agreement must define this formally. And sixth, does it grant audit rights? If there is no documented right to audit the supplier, the inspector will note that you cannot fulfill your GMP oversight obligations. Audit rights are always checked and always cited when missing. Let me finish with the most common mistakes I see in practice, so you can avoid them. The first mistake is that the agreement exists but was never reviewed after signing. The regulatory standard requires periodic review. An agreement that has not been updated in 3 years while the supplier has changed their process, their site, or their personnel is a major finding. Schedule annual reviews and document that they occurred. The second mistake is a vague scope. Agreements that say the supplier covers all activities are meaningless from a regulatory perspective. Name every specific activity, product, method, and specification. Precision is what regulators expect. The third mistake is the supplier changing a critical process without notifying anyone. This is a critical risk. The change notification requirements in your agreement must be specific enough and enforceable enough that this cannot happen in practice. Follow up on notifications at every performance review meeting with the supplier. The fourth mistake is having no audit rights clause. This is a critical finding in any inspection. If a prospective supplier refuses to grant you audit rights, they cannot be qualified as a GMP supplier. This is a non-negotiable requirement. Every agreement must contain it. And the fifth mistake is having the technical agreement managed by procurement rather than QA. This is a systemic gap that creates multiple risks. Procurement manages commercial contracts. QA manages technical agreements. The two documents must be consistent with each other, but they serve different purposes and require different expertise to create and manage. Let us bring it all together. 6 things to remember from this lecture. Number 1. A technical agreement is a GMP requirement under EU GMP Chapter 7, FDA 21 CFR 211, and ICH Q10. For every outsourced GMP activity, a written agreement must exist. Number 2. The responsibility matrix is the heart of the agreement. Every critical GMP activity must have exactly one responsible party. Shared responsibility without clear escalation paths is a compliance gap. Number 3. Change notification requirements must be specific. Define what changes require pre-approval, which require notification only, and which must be documented. Informal notification is not acceptable. Number 4. Audit rights are non-negotiable. If a supplier will not grant them, they cannot be qualified. Every agreement must include the right to audit and the minimum frequency. Number 5. A signed agreement is not the end. Annual review, supplier performance monitoring, and a change tracking log keep the agreement live and inspection ready. Number 6. QA must own technical agreements. Procurement manages commercial contracts. These are two different documents serving two different purposes. That is Lecture 19 complete. Coming next in Lecture 20, we cover the Certificate of Analysis. The COA is a document you will handle almost every working day in a GMP laboratory or quality role. In Lecture 20, you will learn how to read every field of a COA correctly, what to check and verify before accepting it, and what should make you stop and investigate before releasing materials. If this lecture was useful, please give it a like. Subscribe if you have not already. And drop your questions in the comments below. I read and replied to everyone. I will see you in Lecture 20.